Hi, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan, and I am so delighted to have on with me Dr. Dennis Tourish from the UK. Scotland?
UK.
Dennis? UK. I had it right the first time. And Dennis and I go back many, many years, and I interviewed him when I was researching the cult of Trump. And since that time, so much has happened, Dennis. And I've also finished my doctoral dissertation on undue influence in the law. And we've been in touch because you've worked writing academic journal articles, not only about reevaluation co-counseling, which I just cited in a blog, but you've written about Enron, WeWork, Theranos. You've been researching corporate cults, which is fascinating. But I also wanted to make sure to get your point of view on what's the craziness that's happening in the world, and in particular with the Trump, devotees and such. So, Dennis, I'm going to give you the floor. Tell us, first of all, where do you teach? Where are you? How do people find you? And then go from there, please.
Okay. Well, thank you, Stephen. Congratulations on your doctorate as well, by the way.
Thank you.
Uh, I work at the University of Sussex in the business school, where I'm a professor of leadership and organization studies. But of course, my background in terms of cultism grows out of personal experience, being a member of a left wing group in the UK, which I absolutely believe was a cult. And with another former.
And it led to you writing this excellent book on political cults on the left and the right. And I'm going to interrupt you and just say, I get accused all the time by people who are Trump supporters that I'm in the cult of the left. And I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm against authoritarianism on the left and the right.
Yeah.
Back to you.
As am I would say.
Yeah.
And I co-wrote that book with a guy who was also an American Trotskyist who passed away recently, Tim Woolforth. But as
Uh,
you say, we looked at the right and the left, because as you know, Steve, despite the differences in belief systems, what strikes you when you study any cult are the similarities that they have with each other in terms of things like their devotion to a mindset, a belief system, an ideology that purports to explain everything, and of course to an individual leader who is a supreme authority at interpreting that ideology and therefore is uniquely well placed to solve everyone's problems, or so goes the story.
yeah.
And you mentioned these corporates as well, because it isn't just in politics or psychotherapy or religion, but I do think that some business organizations have the potential to go down this road as well, and a number have done.
Yeah, absolutely. And my doctoral program was on organizational change and development, and I was very surprised when I started my program to learn that Edgar Schein was legendary in the business area, and Edgar Schein had written the book Coercive Persuasion, having studied Chinese communist brainwashing of the 50s along with Robert Lifton, whose model you use in your analyses, and Margaret Singer, of course, and Jolly West. So, can you say a little bit more about corporate cults? Like, how would anybody who's working at a corporation know if they're in a corporate destructive cult or authoritarian cult?
Yeah. I'm surprised by Edgar Schein's influence in this area as well. And he did, as you say, this fabulous work in the 50s about Chinese coercive persuasion, and then seems to have set it aside and moved on to a fairly conventional analysis of business organizations. But to answer your question, it's best maybe to give examples. And then an example that I've been studying a lot recently is Theranos, which was this Silicon Valley based biotech company, which purported to have a technology enabling it to run hundreds of tests on a tiny little sample of blood that would enable more accurate and early diagnosis of serious illnesses such as cancer. And it was fronted by this charismatic young woman, Elizabeth Holmes, who was only 19 when she set it up. She became the youngest female billionaire in Wall Street history. She was photographed with Bill Clinton, Joe Biden, Barack Obama, various other people. The board of her company was populated by the likes of Henry Kissinger, and the recently deceased George Shultz, and various other eminent people with a military background. So, what is it that made it cult like? Well, I would say that first of all, it was the amount of emphasis that was placed on her personally was one of the key giveaways. The second is that the mission of the organization was completely oversold. She told employees, for example, that the work that they were engaged in was the most important work in the history of humanity, which is quite a claim to make. On other occasions, she compared their organizational culture to religion, said she was trying to build a religion within Theranos. Her key people told people that if they didn't believe that this was the most important thing that they would ever do in their lives, they should leave and leave now.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody who expressed any reservations about this was instantly dismissed. So the sort of black inside humor was that they disappeared. They were never spoken of again.
Mm-hmm.
And this was combined with intense surveillance of existing employees through CCTV footage, the presence of security guards everywhere, the compulsive signing of non-disclosure agreements, the hiring of heavy-hitting top American lawyers to pursue anybody who was remotely suspected of leaking information to the press. And so it goes on, and so it goes on. And of course, the employees were expected to work preposterous hours in the service of the organization and its guru. And I think that's always a key sign that something is wrong, that if you're not willing to work 12, 14 plus hours per day, you're showing insufficient commitment.
And they're not paying extra for those hours, right?
No, it's essentially an exploitative relationship.
Mm.
And very often, as in the case of Theranos, one that's built on deception or an outright lie, because it turns out that their technology never worked and probably never would have worked either.
Right. Yeah, and I know when you analyzed Enron, you used Robert Lifton's 8 criteria as my recollection. Did you use Lifton's criteria when you were looking at Theranos too?
To some extent, perhaps not so much, because I was thinking about it more in terms of what I've come to view as neo-totalitarianism within organizations. They aren't completely totalitarianism you find in totalitarian state regimes for a number of reasons, including that they typically don't have a Gestapo or a Stasi to get rid of their opponents. But they nevertheless do create this semi-authoritarian, totalitarian environment. And so much of it is built around controlling people's language, through which you control their thoughts, through controlling their time, through which you control their behaviors, and so on. It's fairly classic, and therefore I think it is useful not to think about cults exclusively, as I say, in terms of politics, religion, or whatever. There seems to me to be very few spheres of human activity that can't be manipulated by unscrupulous leaders to create cult-like formations.
Yep. And as you know, my work, I developed the BITE model, behavior control, information, thought, and emotional control, based on Festinger's cognitive dissonance model. And it seems to be getting a lot of validation from people who read my dissertation or read my books. Yeah. Because people can go, oh yeah, they asked me to change my clothing. Oh yeah, they threaten you if you try to talk to any critics or former members, or they threaten to harass you if you want to leave, etc.
Yeah.
So
I'm about 3/4 of the way through your dissertation at the moment, and I'm finding it fascinating from all these different points of view. And I think that that's just, crucial, this control of behavior, emotion, intellect, thought, this relentless peer pressure to conform. And I think when I think about things like Theranos, it's combined with this attempt to transform a business into something that purports to have a transcendent ideology, which is generally absurd. So I've begun to look at WeWork recently, for example, which I know is the subject of a major documentary in the US on the Hulu channel at the moment, founded by this guy, Adam Newman, who he looked a little bit like the stereotypical image of Jesus Christ when you see him in action talking to his people, the long hair, the charisma, the public performance. And again, at the end of the day, he was just renting office desks. But he was talking about this as a way of changing the world by bringing people together. And I think that's a clue here that we're in the presence of something potentially dangerous when something rather prosaic and everyday is being hyped beyond anything that could possibly make sense.
Yeah, I was interviewed by a book. I'm not remembering the author, but I'll look it up for the blog that will go with this video. But the book was called The Culting of Brands. It was a business book, and he was particularly interested in learning about how cults maintain devotees and how it can be taught to businesses to make good consumers and good employees that are, obedient and loyal and all of that. And it just really seems that the unethical social psychological influences that you and I have studied for so long have been imported in so many different venues, including politics and, business.
Business. Yes, and I mean, I think there are many business contexts, for example, banking, finance, Wall Street, where this culture of excessive hours is endemic and required. A couple of years ago, we had an intern here in the UK working in a bank who died after I think pulling 3 days without any sleep whatsoever,
Wow.
working for the organization. That very tragic example of what we're talking about. But if you invest that much time in any activity, it's almost bound to become obsessional. And the line between you and your work disappears because there is no beyond work. Everything revolves around the work. And that was certainly the case at Enron as well in terms of its trading floor. I mean, for younger people mightn't remember it, but in 2001, when it went bankrupt, it was the biggest bankruptcy in US corporate history, all built around accounting fraud.
Yep.
And again, it was the same sort of language that prevailed, that you had to devote everything to the organization. You worked 70-hour weeks. You had to rely on the infallible genius of its two leaders, Ken Lay and Jeffrey Skilling, who only recently has gotten out of prison for his role in this particular debacle. But it was all fundamentally deception, deception, deception. And of course, that's true of any variety of cults that you care to mention.
Yeah, and if something's legitimate, it will stand up to scrutiny. And good leadership, invites, oppositional employees to bring up critical questions. And if a leader finds that there was some damage being done, they apologize. They're accountable. They make compensation. They want to have a culture where there's checks and balances against abuse of power.
Absolutely. I mean, I've heard it said that leaders who do not do that, who do not invite criticism and opposition and dissent, what they ultimately create are fragile organizations, because inevitably the leader makes mistakes. And as the leadership scholar, an old friend of mine, Keith Grint, has written in one of his books, inevitably this means that the leader with the most compliant followers will fail. Because when the leader errs, as they inevitably will do, there is no one to point out that this is a terrible mistake. So you have to cultivate that degree of openness, because otherwise the organization is only as robust as the latest decision of its leader. And nobody makes perfect decisions all the time about anything, let alone in a large organization where there are so many variables at play.
Yep. So I can't resist. What do you think of Trump?
Yeah, we talked about this some time ago, and
The malignant narcissism, the incapacity for empathy, the grandiosity, the transactional, aspects, the believing he's above the law, pathological lying, the sadism, the harassment, all of the malignant
all of
narcissistic.
that. I'm reading a book at the moment that came out a couple of years ago. I think it's entitled "Why Democracies Die." It's written by a couple
Good
of
book.
scholars, yes. And it was, I think, mostly written in 2016, just after Donald Trump had come to power. So that book doesn't just talk about Trump, it talks about other people, but it makes it clear that democracies become imperiled mostly these days from the inside. by people who are elected democratically, but then show absolute contempt for democratic norms, for the idea of objective truth, for the institutions that in theory they have sworn to uphold and protect, and who produce this dialogue that only they have the correct answers, only they can save the country, and that their enemies, their opponents, aren't just opponents, but their enemies out
Right.
there as well. And those are all things that clearly characterize the persona of Donald Trump. What is perhaps the only reason he really matters now, of course, is that he's come to dominate the Republican Party. So in America, Steve, you're in this position where one of the two main parties is defining itself as against democracy, against truth, against science, against evidence, pro bigotry, pro emotion, pro rhetoric, and in a sense, after January the 6th, pro violence as well. So it's a very dangerous period where people seem impervious to evidence, but very much enthralled to the rhetoric of an authoritarian populist leader who tells them what they want to hear. The idea that you can just have, that you can confuse opinions with facts and leave facts entirely out of the equation is pretty much historically unprecedented in this scale in the US, I think. What do you think?
It's unprecedented. Yes, I agree. And people who are sworn to uphold the Constitution and the rule of law are violating them consistently. And we have a real problem, as I wrote in my book, with authoritarian cults in general in America, many of them claiming nonprofit religious status, but they're in fact political entities. And this has infiltrated our law enforcement, our media, so many other dimensions of society that I wanted to ask you if you've thought, because people ask me all the time, like, how do we develop interventions to scale 70 million Americans and the global reach of authoritarianism? I saw a little snippet of Joe Biden at the G7 after the G7 initial meeting, and he was saying that, you know, there are these countries run by autocrats, and then there are the, you know, countries that believe in democracy, and the democratic countries need to come together to figure out how do we cope with this upsurgence of authoritarianism, which includes China, of course.
Of course it does, yes. And it's therefore a wide-ranging problem, isn't it, that goes beyond the US. We think about it a lot in terms of Trump in the US because of your country's huge importance and significance in the world. But in Hungary, Poland, to some extent in Britain, and in various other countries, similar phenomenon are at play. And it's not always easy to figure out why it has acquired this influence that it has among people. I mean, one reason, of course, is this blatant appeal to prejudice and to nationalist sentiment as well, which characterizes all of this. But that then just begs the other question: why is it that these appeals are so potent as we speak at present? And I don't know if there is an easy answer to that. And if there is, that will be the beginning of a solution. I mean, part of me suspects that part of the reason for these exceptional appeals is this developing feeling among many people that somehow they've been left behind, that they haven't gained from globalization or economic growth to the extent that they deserve to, or that other people have had. So to that extent, it might suggest that growing inequality in different countries, growing economic inequalities have contributed to this. And we have to be careful what we hope for, because as Steven Pinker points out in his book, Enlightenment Now, the most equal societies historically have also been the most impoverished, if we go back thousands or even hundreds of years. That said, maybe the process has gone too far, and maybe we need to look at different economic models that can generate some kind of spirit of hope and show people that there is a way forward for them as human beings, as economic actors, as family units, and so on, beyond simply appealing to this outdated idea of America first, or Britain first, or Poland first, or whatever it happens to be. We just live at a time when that isn't going to salvage anything because we're too interdependent in terms of the problems that we face.
Exactly, like global climate crisis and the pandemic are two very clear examples of how solutions for the survival of planet Earth need to be global and not isolationist in countries. My feeling is biased, of course, by my experiences of the last 47 and a half years, starting with being in the Moonies. But as I wrote in the Cult of Trump, I just see a increasing sophistication in understanding the human mind and understanding human interactions. Neuroscience, but one of the biggest things is the creation of the digital environment where people are spending hours on smartphones. When I was in the Moonies, we tried to get people isolated to a camp to indoctrinate them. These days, everybody has cell phones, and they're being indoctrinated virtually. And they don't need to go anywhere physically because they're sitting at home, and hour after hour, their brains are being immersed in propaganda, disinformation, indoctrination. And their social circles are all this bubble. And, John Atack, former Scientologist. And do you know Yuval Laor?
No.
He's an Israeli American who has a very important theory about emotions and awe and infatuation, and that I think really is very important in terms of how people are being emotionally manipulated about fear and aversion of the enemy, the black and white all or nothing thing. Make the terrible devil, amplify. And I should say that Eric Hoffer wrote about this in 1954, the True Believer book, that a strength of a mass movement could be evaluated by the vividness and tangibility of its devil, which I thought was very, very well said. But this emotional thing of celebrity status, but also awe, just and painting a picture that simplifies the complexity of the world for people and gives them a solution with a daddy figure who says, "I know everything. Trust me. I know more than the generals, and I know more than the economists, and we got this covered." That's something very soothing, even to very highly educated people, the desire to believe that there's a solution. There's a desire to believe someone has an answer. And I can assure you that I agree with you. No human is perfect, and power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So we need checks and balances. But I'm going to go out on a limb and say that I think the solution is worldwide education about how the mind works and what's the difference between ethical influence and unethical influence. And we need to teach and do preventive education and inoculation with everybody, but we need to develop intervention services for those who've already been co-opted, who may be now mobilized to be some type of army to do violence and to do the bidding of cult leaders. And we need to do recovery services. We need to have a change in consciousness that does accept the fact that we are living on this globe that's spinning in space. And whatever happens, if someone detonates a nuclear bomb, the fallout's going to touch everything. That pandemic, again, and the global climate crisis, to me, is the most powerful demonstrations that the solution for our survival and survival of our children and our great-grandchildren and our great-great-great grandchildren, is coming together to think, how can we do this life project together in a sane way that's sustainable.
Yeah.
That's my speech.
Well, thank you. It's a good speech. Uh, yes, I think one thing we've learned in the past year is that no, you cannot build a wall that will keep out a pandemic, and nor can you build a wall that will keep out the climate. So we have to do something a bit different. And I do think if people were, as you suggest, more educated on things like the techniques of influence and persuasion and dynamics of cult formation, to exercise some skepticism around the idea that there is a simple answer to complex problems, that would be helpful. But beyond that, I think we also need people to be educated in evidence-based reasoning, to understand, as I think Carl Sagan once put it, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And without that, you've just got wind. So, for example, in relation to Trump, we've heard again and again and again that the election was stolen, that it was rigged. I haven't seen any piece of evidence, even weak evidence, to support that. It's just become a matter of opinion. That's all. No evidence whatsoever.
In fact, there's evidence the other way that courts have looked at the facts, and even a Republican in charge of cybersecurity for the election appointed by Trump, Chris Krebs, said even Bill Barr, who was, violating so many, alleged to violating so many laws and proper conduct, said that there was no election fraud. So instead of, I'd flip it around and say it's up to them to prove that there was widespread fraud, and there isn't.
But we just seem to be in a period where people feel that you can utterly ignore the evidence and jump to a conclusion that supports the conclusion that you wanted to be the case. And that's very, 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 very dangerous, not just in terms of politics, democracy, and so on, but in life in general. And if there's one thing that we learn at school, one would hope, never mind college and university, it's always to follow the evidence. And we know that all evidence is imperfect. That's the nature of the beast. But to disregard evidence completely, as has often been the case with populist and authoritarian forces, is incredible. And to see it take hold over so many people is positively scary.
Yeah, well, that's because there was collusion with media, with foreign actors, with Christian right, with authoritarian cults that have existed for decades in the United States, who have an agenda to destroy democracy, to insert a theocracy, and it's, all I can say is that we need to get out of our sleep or our numbness, and many of us are numb from just the being subjected to the disinformation for years. Yeah. We need to shake ourselves off and get working, because we know that the Trump cult is working very hard with lots of money and lots of digital assets being employed, lots of trolls, and we really need to get going.
Well, you mentioned earlier something which we should return to, and this is very different from when you and I were younger, I should say, and joined two different types of cults.
Yeah, I was in a right-wing cult, you were in a left-wing cult.
And that is that in those days, to win you over, they had to physically bring you to a group meeting of some kind and subject you to things like love bombing from other people who were already in the group, who were suddenly your best friends and so on. But as you say, due to technology these days, you can skip that process. And I was talking just earlier to a former member of a Trotskyist cult that I mentioned to you before we began, who describes the process whereby he was recruited, and it was completely through the internet. It was through finding this body of literature and becoming in some way obsessed by it, by eventually realizing that he was reading very little but that type of information. Right. And then confirmation biases, as we call them, kick in, which is the human tendency to see only things around you that confirm the conclusions that you have already reached, which creates this distorted view of the world in which evidence that you're wrong is either completely not seen or else is subject to taxing demands for rectitude that you do not apply to the other kind of evidence, which tells you that you're right. This is something which is, very different and potentially very dangerous in the world. In a way, people can be groomed online into all kinds of somewhat ridiculous belief systems in a way that wasn't possible 20, 30, or 40 years ago.
Exactly. And AI is another factor. If you gather 5,000 data points on each person, as I'm told exists for Americans, voting age, you can use AI to identify the key buttons to push of what are the big social action levers to push to get somebody involved. And we saw that with QAnon. Oh, save the children. The children are being trafficked and by pedophiles. And of course, who's not going to want to protect children from trafficking? I mean, that's part of my work, is to protect people from trafficking, sex and labor trafficking. But it's very emotionally evocative.
It is very emotionally evocative. And human beings are also naturally predisposed to stories and narratives. So that story that the children are under threat, that they are being cannibalized, that they are being slaughtered for ritual purposes and so on, is likely to evoke some kind of response. And it's a simple explanation for why things are the way that they are. It does remind me of some of the awful rubbish stories in centuries gone by about Jewish people poisoning the wells to kill Christians and things of that kind. Again, let's remind ourselves.
And the Protocols and the Elders of Zion was a Russian propaganda thing that Jews were killing babies to get their blood to have matzah or some crazy
I think it might have begun as a Tsarist police forgery or something.
I think you're right.
Still widely believed in these particular circles. So the key thing is anybody can claim anything, but we must always train ourselves to say, what evidence are they actually producing that this is the case? Well, where is hardcore evidence? Mere assertion or the fervency of your belief in it isn't evidence. It's a fundamental point that one would hope that education, among other things, can address and get people to realize.
Yeah, and I guess I want to say that one of the tricks that cults use, I know I did it in the Moonies, was to, when I was lecturing to recruit people, I'd say, and you can go to the library and you can open up the history textbooks and you can research this for yourself that this is true. And by saying it with such certitude, no one ever researched. Yeah. And what I hear from former QAnon followers and other people, they would spout the same words, do the research. And then I'd be like, show me the evidence. And they send me 40 links to our documentaries and videos, and they're all propaganda.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, that performance of certainty is important in this. I remember when I was in my group, a former Trotskyist leader arguing with me one day. He said, I think the job of a leader when they're appearing in public is to appear even more certain of what they're arguing than they might feel at that particular moment, which I thought was a very revealing comment. But of course, it's manipulative nonsense to actually behave in that way, because you're just pretending to believe in something that you aren't. And part of that process as well is what I think these websites that you just alluded to do. It's the cherry picking of evidence. I know that Trotskyist groups, for example, what they do is they go through main newspapers, pick out the gloomiest possible set of facts and figures that they can find, the most pessimistic conclusions of expert analysts, and then present these as objective evidence of impending absolute catastrophe and crisis. But what they do is they leave aside any indicator that indicates that there might be something positive about to happen, or that we have made some kind of progress in addressing some of our problems. So if you read the cult literature, the world is always in crisis. Not only that, it's always in terminal crisis.
Yeah.
Not only that, it's about to explode. And therefore the urgency is now, you must commit to this group to do something about it. And surely, Steve, that's similar on both the left and the right.
Yeah, 100%. And you hit so many important key points there in just a few sentences. But I would also add, along with cherry picking how bad things are, they cherry pick quotes from famous people that people admire and respect, use those words out of context to bolster their arguments. And unless you, again, do the research and actually study who's being quoted, you go, wait a minute, this is the opposite of what Einstein's believed or said, for example.
And of course, we find also with these groups that when they make predictions that fail, these are just ignored. And we know that Jehovah's Witnesses had all these predictions about the end of the world, literally, that haven't come true.
Right.
Trotskyists and Marxists have been predicting the final collapse of capitalism for 100 plus years now. But the QAnon movement also has had its fair share of predictions that have already been falsified, including that Biden would never actually secure the presidency. But on that day, there would be an intervention and Trump would magically be confirmed as a second term. I don't know how they rationalize away that failure, but it's a common cult tactic because it's fundamentally nonsense.
Yeah, it's cognitive dissonance theory predicts the more extreme the behavior, the more you rationalize it. So once you're in, you were talking about confirmation bias. There's an inertia of belief that keeps you and it's lost cost fallacy. Is that
sunk
cost fallacy? Where, well, even though I'm walking 3 miles to the store to pick up the butter, and I find out after 1.5 miles that it's closed, I might as well keep walking because I've gone all this way. I might as well just finish it up. And it's like, but it's closed. It's not going to get you where you thought you were going to get to.
And I think also, Steve, one of the difficulties we have thinking our way through this is that people often have a simple view of identity, that I am me. And I've stumbled just today across a notion known as identity fusion, which tries to explain how actually our sense of self is very porous. That when we join a high demand, high activity, high belief group, we begin to lose what is that defines us as unique individuals. We begin, in other words, to merge with the group, to define ourselves in terms of the most positive traits that we associate with that group, and therefore allow them, in a way, into our soul, allow them to dominate us, to take us over, to transform our personality very much. And I know you've written about this in the past, the way that there is your pre-cult identity, and then it's somehow supplanted by a cult identity. And the challenge is to get people to look back to what they were before and find a road back to it.
Yeah, exactly. And I want to mention a book that I loved. I read it twice. Adam Grant's book, Think Again. I don't know if you've heard of it yet, but it's a wonderful book, and he talks about the necessity of not connecting your ego to your beliefs and being specifically open to data to reevaluate things, to actually create challenge networks in your life of intelligent, respected people who will just, for the sake of being a contrarian, keep you fresh. And he interviews people like, I think, Daniel Kahneman, who is like, I like to be proven wrong, because all that matters is that the society and the world gets to be a little closer to an accurate description of what's reality. Versus, I need to keep my model going, and so I'm going to suppress anyone who writes anything negative.
Yeah, I think we overvalue consistency of opinion in our society, actually, and we tend to look on people who change their minds once or often with some disdain, whereas it's a sign of growth very often. And I tend to think that if when you're 60, you have the same worldview that you have when you're 20, you've wasted 40 years of experience somewhere along the line. So we need to cherish dissent and disagreement, but also encourage ourselves to look at the evidence, change our minds where it's appropriate, and I think resist this process of identity fusion. The more committed we feel to the group, the more important we feel that the group membership is to us, the more we find ourselves using language that we might not have used before, but that we have picked up as a result of our membership of this group or our obsessive reading of its literature, the more we should be worried that we have a bit of a problem going on.
Yeah, it's brilliant. And I'll just say the way I think about it when I'm doing therapy with people coming out of these authoritarian groups is I describe it in terms of locus of control. That when you're a baby, your parents have to influence everything, but if they're healthy parents, they want to do developmentally appropriate parenting because they know their goal is to help you become an adult that's capable of functioning on your own, unlike unhealthy parents that want you to be dependent and obedient and believe what they say is the truth, no matter what. And yeah, I lost my train of thought, but I got at least part of it out in terms
Well,
of
I know what you mean. It's
locus
like
of control, right? So the group is external locus of control, right? And if it becomes internalized as yours, you've lost your authentic self, your conscience, your ability to reality test.
Mhm. That's about the capacity that we need to cherish for independent thinking, isn't it?
Yeah.
And if we find that we have a revered figure in our lives and we cannot think of a single thing that we would criticize about them, or a single opinion that we would dissent from them on, or a single thing that they would ask us to do that we could imagine refusing, those are all red flags, surely.
Yeah, I'm really enjoying talking with you. We should do this again soon, but I'm reminded of an Oprah Winfrey episode that I was on in 1989 with a cult called Church Universal and Triumphant, where the cult leader Elizabeth Clare Prophet prophesied Russia was going to nuke America and was selling bomb shelters. And there were about 50 members of the cult in the audience. And Oprah puts the microphone in and asks a woman, "How many years have you been in this group?" "Oh, 10 years. Are you brainwashed?" And she said, "Oh, no, not at all. I'm a businesswoman. I'm successful." And Oprah put her hands on her hips and said to me, "See?" And I said, "Oprah, if you asked me when I was in the Moonies, I would have said the same thing." But she never asked me the follow-up question, which is what I want to say now, is what could I have asked and in what way? And it was your comment that stimulated the story. And it would be, so you've been in 10 years. In 10 years, tell me 3 things you don't agree with Elizabeth Clare Prophet about. Or 3 things you don't like about the Church Universal and Triumphant. And then watch the eyes go, "Oh, I'm very happy. I'm fine. There's nothing wrong with her. She's great. The church is wonderful. It saved my life." Those are the types of questions to tell if somebody is actually thinking critically for themselves. Because everybody has some complaint about any human being, I can assure you.
And unfortunately, going back to Donald Trump, very
Yeah.
many of his core supporters can't disagree with him on anything, don't think that he has any faults, deny that he's ever made any mistakes, and will continue to do so. But we have to keep on arguing for truth in this world, because that ultimately is what matters. And there
Yeah.
are real facts out there. There aren't alternative truths. There's just the truth.
Yeah, and I just did an interview and blog with a man who was in my cult for 36 years before he got out and woke up and has now been speaking out about them. And I'm so grateful my family helped me because I got to get out after almost dying in a van crash, but I got to have a life for those decades. And he's now coming out going, "Now what do I do?" I know I trusted them for my retirement that the world was going to be, what they said it was going to be, and it's not.
This is what really upsets me about many of these groups, actually, the way that people invest decades of their life. I spent a decade or so in my group. I was 28 when I left. I had to rebuild everything from scratch, but at least I had the time to do it.
Yeah, and you're a professor.
I'm a professor and I write books and I talk to interesting people like you. And in relation to that book, anybody watching, let me remind you, it's ridiculously expensive to buy. So if you drop me an email, I'll send you a free PDF.
Okay. We'll add, with your permission, a way to, people can email me and we can forward it. I want to thank you. I have another another call to do now, but this has been a joy and so many important points. So thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Dennis Torish.
Really, always a pleasure to see you.
Thanks again.